The Verona Committee of the Whole, and we'll begin with the roll call, please. Mr. Burns?
Manley?
Here.
Yours?
Here.
Bear?
Here.
Reekie?
Here.
Hokemer?
Here.
McGilvery?
Here.
Doyle?
Here.
Diaz?
Here.
Steiner?
Here.
We have everyone present. Thank you for that very much. We do, on the Committee of the Whole agenda, we do have public comment this evening. What I would suggest to you, though, is that if you have public comment, it won't take all that long. We want to make sure we get through the presentation by Mr. Burns on the actual recommended budget. So unless there's anyone that wishes to speak right now before you hear the presentation on the budget, we would prefer that you hold that until the Common Council meeting and we have public comment on that agenda as well. So is there anyone that wishes to speak now under public comment? Anyone that wishes to speak now under public comment? Seeing none, I'm going to ask then for approval of minutes of the September 16, 2013 meeting of the Committee of the Whole. Those meeting minutes were included with your packet. What is your pleasure?
Move approval.
We have a motion by Mr. Manley. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Yurs. Were there any corrections or additions to the minutes of the previous meeting? Seeing none, all those in favor of approval of the minutes signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion carried, and those minutes are approved. So with that, we will turn it over to Mr. Burns, and he will do the presentation of the recommended budget.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. I have a presentation this evening on the recommended budget as well as some additional information setting the context and talking about the scenarios and the process for the budget from here through the remainder of the process. So I'll move through the material and try to move fairly quickly, but if anyone does have any questions or something's not clear, please let me know, and then I'd be happy to answer questions at the end as well. Starting with our budget objectives, and this is very similar to what we talked about when we went through the budget kickoff presentation earlier this fall. But some of the objectives that the city has looked at in prior years and again this year in putting the recommended budget together is, first of all, trying to recommend a moderate tax rate increase, covering the costs and debt service and maintaining service levels. Considering prioritization of service level enhancements to be phased in over time, and as we had a lot of requests in the in the requested budget this year, it was very critical to prioritize those requests. Include a modest increase in the cost of living adjustment consistent with market trends to make sure that the city's compensation remains competitive with our peer municipalities. Evaluating options for compensation and benefit adjustments. Reviewing staffing levels for all departments, including looking at comparisons to other communities, as well as updating the city's multi-year projections. A few items related to the fiscal context that we're operating within with this budget. And one of the key items is always looking at the city's property tax base. This chart shows the percentage change in the city's non-TIF district equalized value, and that's the portion of the city's tax base that's available to fund the city's current operations that's not included within TIF districts, which are not available for general costs. And you can see the city did have some larger increases in 2008, 2009, and if you look back to prior years when the city was growing very rapidly during the 2000s, you'd see similar increases. 2013 represents the fourth year in a row that the city has had much more modest increases in our non-TIF district equalized value. We've been slightly negative, then a 1.3% increase in 2011, 0.7% in 2012, and back to a 1.3% increase in 2013. During that same period, if you look at other communities in Dane County, several communities actually saw decreases in their equalized value. So comparatively, we've been doing good compared to other communities in the area, but it has put a limit on the amount of growth and the ability to cover costs within our operating budget. We are expecting that those numbers will start to increase in the future. We had a lot of development activity in 2013 that we expect would be in place for the values for 2014. We're also looking forward to additional items that are being developed outside of TIF districts or the future closure of TIF districts that will help improve those values. We talked during the budget kickoff presentation about the city's property tax levy limit, And the city finds itself in an unusual situation this year that we have a fairly large increase in our levy limit under state law. However, as I just pointed out, we don't have a large increase in our available tax base to take advantage of that. And the reason for that is the property tax levy limit includes an adjustment for net new construction. However, that adjustment for the levy limit takes into account growth within the city's TIF districts. Therefore, our net new construction is 8.5% for 2013 for the 2014 budget. However, as I just mentioned, our overall non-TIF equalized value is only a 1.3% increase. The effect of that is that we're looking at a levy limit increase that would allow us to increase our levy by about $651,000. However, we don't have all of the tax base available to do that without seeing increases in the tax rate, and that plays into some of the scenarios and the recommendations that we put forward. We've also talked about the city's staffing projections, and this slide is a summary of the staffing projections that were put together in the 2013 recommended and approved budget. And you can see that over the past 4 years, the city has grown by between about half a position a year to a high of 2 positions per year. And the projection when we put the budget together last year was that overall we'd be growing at somewhere between 1.5 and 2 positions per year, trying to keep that balance between meeting the demands of growth of the community and keeping a modest tax rate increase. And during the prior 4 years, the primary areas where we've added staff have been some additional staffing for the library, police department, and then also during this time period, the city and the town of Rhoda have made additional investments in the fire department. Debt service is a large portion of the city's budget and something that we always take a look at as we're doing our budgeting and future projections. And this slide shows our existing debt service, which is represented by the blue bars, and then new debt service projected, which is in the orange, shown being layered on top of the existing debt service. And we're anticipating that we will have a couple of additional years where we will see increases in our property tax levy to support debt service. And some of the primary factors for that, we're still paying debt for some of the city facilities, including this facility and the library. The city is looking at additional borrowing related to a fire and EMS station that's planned over the next couple of years. We're also looking at a large street improvement project, which would be the city's share of the County Highway M reconstruction and the intersection with County Highway M and PD coming up. And then we're also seeing the impact of a decision that was made several budgets ago to start funding our annual street mill and overlay project entirely through borrowing rather than splitting that partially through cash funding it and partially through borrowing. And that's something that's in our financial plan that we would like to get back towards paying those types of things on a cash-supported basis, but in the short term that is affecting our debt service. So we can see there's an increase from 13 to 14, and then again to 15 and 16 we're projecting increases, and then we're expecting that to start to level off. Trying to look at that increase in debt service and what impact that has on the tax rate and on the taxpayer, we have a slide here that has a couple different projections. The projection in orange, the top line, is based on the information that the city's financial advisor, Ehlers & Associates, put together earlier this year in the summer of 2013 when the city issued its bond issue for 2013. And as part of that presentation, we always work with them and do an update of what the projection is for the tax rate, not just for the current year, but for the next several years coming up. And what they are projecting is that the city would see increases in our portion of the tax rate related to debt service, and kind of following that trend on that last chart, that we would see an increase in 14, again in 15, 2016, and then seeing that peak at about $2.90 per thousand, and then starting to level off and trail off in the future years. We've also updated a city projection, and that is the line that's in blue. And the difference between those two lines is that Ehlers used a very conservative assumption for growth of the community. They were using a discounted straight line projection of the city's equalized value. So they basically were looking at what is the amount of growth that we've seen in our non-TIF tax base, discounting that, and then projecting that forward at a constant rate. In the city projection, we've also updated it based on our best known estimates for development activity that we've seen during the year in 2013, additional growth on the EPIC campus that's taking place outside of the TIF district, which would be development in campus 4 and 5 projected. And we're also showing the projected impact of the closure of the EPIC TIF district in 2015, which we would start to see the effects of in our 2016 budget. So based on that, we are expecting that we would see an increase from 14 to 15, and that would be a fairly sizable increase. However, with that closure of the TIF district projected in 2016 and some of those additional values coming on, that we would see that come back down and stabilize at about the $2 per thousand rate, which is where we are right now in 2016 and then in future years.
And Bill, a question on this one. Do you remember, I'm assuming that in these projections, we built in a slight increase into the percentage of the dollars, or percentage of the amount we'd be paying on interest?
Yes, we have. As part of the projections behind this, it's showing what our capital improvement plan would show for future projects and future borrowing. And then working with Ellers, we have projected that the farther out we go, that there would be some higher interest rates, because we know that we're likely going to see interest rates rising over time.
Okay. Mr. Manley?
Bill, does either the Ellers projection or the city projection reflect the approximate, and I know that the number is not finalized yet, but the current placeholder is $7 million for the fires and EMS station, and that's reflected in this projection?
Yes, that's included in both projections.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, the project costs under both projections are the same. The only difference is looking at the equalized value growth estimates.
Mr. Diaz?
I'm wondering if you could explain the logic behind the decision to move the street mill and overlay program mostly to borrowing.
Yeah, I can comment on that. That was done several years ago, and I think it was looking at trying to keep the city's overall tax rate lower in the short term and try to find ways to do that and to stay within the levy limits that were in place at that time. And this year, as I mentioned, we're in a unique situation where we have more levy limit capacity than we're projecting to use. In prior years, that has not always been the case, and the city has been much more constrained by the levy limit. And borrowing, it does not count towards the levy limit.
Go ahead, Bill.
Okay. Okay, shifting gears to talk about the 2014 recommended budget itself. This slide just provides a summary of some of the key numbers that we were looking at in the requested budget and then the recommendation. The city had several requests coming in from departments this year. Our total requested budget was $9.7 million for a property tax levy. That's almost a 20% increase in the city's property tax levy. It included about 13 and a half additional staff positions, and we're estimating that it would have had about an 18% impact on the city portion of the equalized mill rate, which would be a very large rate compared to what we've seen historically. On a city home, with an average home, according to the assessor, is $272,000. That would be a city portion of the tax bill of about $2,100. The recommended budget has a levy of $8.5 million. The direction in putting together the recommended budget was to try to keep the projected tax rate increase to 3% or less, and the recommended budget comes in at that 3%. In order to do that, it had to prioritize a lot of the funding requests that came in. Additional staff recommended to be added is 2.5 positions compared to the 13.4 that were requested. And we're projecting then that the tax on a $272,000 home within the city would be about $1,841, which is a slight increase over the prior year, but much less of an increase than what the original requested budget.
Mr. Years?
Mr. Burns, could you tell me what the estimated city tax is currently?
Yeah, for an average home, it's about $1,825. This is a revaluation year, so that makes it a little difficult to compare one year to the next. And I do have some information on the property tax impact later in the presentation that shows some examples of how that change would be from one year to the next. Okay. This slide, again, just provides some additional information on what's included in the recommended budget. This shows the property tax levy for all of the various funds that include property tax funding support. I'm not going to go through all of the numbers, but just wanted to highlight that the main areas where city tax dollars go are, first of all, to our general fund, $3.5 million, and that includes our police department, public works department, administration, a lot of our general services departments. The next largest area is debt service, which is a little over $2 million, or 24% of the total. And then other large components are the library, both operations and debt service, fire department, and then some of the other special revenue funds coming in. Yeah.
Go ahead. Mr. Barrett, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Burns, could you compare our percent of levy towards the debt service to other communities? Are we comparable, higher, lower?
Yeah, there is a lot of range in that number, depending on the size of the community, the circumstances, whether or not it's a growing community. That is something that we took a close look at earlier this year when the city reviewed and revised its financial management policy. And from the information that we've put together for pure communities, I would say that we are fairly typical with where our split is. Generally, growing communities are going to have a higher percentage in debt service because you're taking on additional infrastructure projects, both streets and facilities. Whereas if you looked at a community like Monona that's not seeing the same level of growth, they're likely going to have a much smaller percentage.
Go ahead, Bill.
Okay, and then I wanted to touch on some of the key items that are recommended for inclusion within the recommended budget. And looking at staffing, since that's a major area of cost, one of the positions that is recommended to be funded is a full-time position in the Public Works Department. That would be a full-time equipment operator at a cost of $67,866 with wages and benefits. That would be the first Public Works Department crew member that has been added by the city since 2006. And since that time, the city has added about 23% to its miles of streets. Some of the primary duties of this position would be helping with de-icing and snow removal, and that's something that really is becoming critical as the city has added miles and added businesses and added residential property to be able to timely respond to snow events and have safe streets and be able to do it in a manner that keeps the people in the trucks for a reasonable amount of time, making sure they're getting adequate rest. This position would also help with traffic painting and crosswalks, street maintenance. When we do our street mill and overlay and other maintenance contracts, we're doing a portion of that work with our own staff in order to reduce cost. This position would help with that and then be available for all other city operations and supporting other departments and facilities as well. This is recommended as a full-time position, and a couple of the reasons why it's recommended at full-time rather than a part-time level is, first of all, to try to attract a candidate with skills in the area of equipment operation. Ideally, we'd be looking to attract somebody from the construction industry or that's worked for another municipality that has experience using some of the heavy equipment so that they can be effective from the beginning. We're also looking for somebody that would be available on short notice if we have snow events in the middle of the night or on weekends, if we have something like a water main break or brush collection from a storm where we call in all of our people from various maintenance departments. We want somebody that is available to respond on those type of situations. Part of why the city has not added a position over the last several years is that we have been able to utilize staff in our utilities from the water, stormwater, and sanitary utility. And that is becoming more limited for a couple of reasons. We have had additional projects that we're undertaking within those utilities, again, as the city has grown. One of the major items we're doing right now is a meter replacement and change-out program that will allow for automated water meter reading. More staff are tied up with that. And also, due to some accounting changes coming from the Public Service Commission, we're also required to have a different method of tracking that. And if we do have utility staff that are spending more time in the city's general operations, we need to reflect for that and pay for that there and cannot place that burden on the utility ratepayers. The city is looking at, and the Public Works Director is looking at alternatives to this position. However, at least from an initial evaluation, the concern is that contracting for snow removal and street maintenance may be more costly for what the benefit is that we get from the position, and that's part of why it's included in the recommended budget. Another position that's recommended to be added in the budget is a full-time patrol officer. The cost for that is $89,199 with wages and benefits, and that would increase the sworn police department staff from 21 to 22. Part of the recommendation for this reflects that the staffing demand continues to grow as the city's population and commercial activity increase, and the city has tried working with the police department to try to maintain a constant level of staffing and be able to respond to that and basically stay ahead of the curve rather than falling behind and having things that are not getting done in a timely manner. Also, the police department has had challenges due to turnover or family medical leave, and I think what we're seeing is that when you get to a department of this size with 21 staff or 22 staff with this position, that you're going to have some level of activity, and you need to account for that and be able to build your budget to accommodate what happens if there are those leaves. The requested budget included both a patrol officer and a police lieutenant in 2014. The recommended budget includes the patrol officer, and one of the thoughts or considerations would be to potentially look at adding the police lieutenant position in 2015, which is a more costly position. However, I think the department's preference and the city's preference, at least speaking for myself and the mayor, would be to hire the police lieutenant if the funds are available. And since the recommended budget came out, we have continued to work in discussions with our finance director and with the police chief to try to find a way to be able to accommodate that within the constraints of the budget. And we think we have a solution for that. For the police lieutenant, the net additional cost compared to the patrol officer in the first year is about $27,000. Our finance director has gone through what she calls a progression analysis, and if we hire a lieutenant, likely what we'd be doing is doing a promotion from a sergeant to a lieutenant, then going through a promotional process for a patrol officer to move into a sergeant position, and then bringing in a new patrol officer. And the net effect of those, you'll have some wage adjustments as you're ultimately bringing in a lower end police officer compared to somebody that's at the higher end of the pay scale. So there will be some savings there that we could recognize. The other thought is to potentially look at not filling the position right away on January 1, which we likely would not be in a position to be able to do anyway with the current vacancies in the department. And normally we would try to be very careful about creating a hole in our budget through the delayed hiring of a position. However, with this new lieutenant position, there's a substantial amount of one-time cost. There's the recruitment cost, a computer, phone, taser, vest, all of the things that go along with a police department position, and that totals about $11,700. So the thought is that we would be able to, in this case, delay that hiring until the end of the first quarter, and we would have those one-time costs built into our budget in 2014 that we would not have to spend again in 2015. That gives us the opportunity to do this without building a hole into the 2015 budget. A couple other items included in the recommended budget. We do have general and personnel contingency funds. Oh, sure.
Go ahead, Mr. Years.
Sorry, before we move on, I don't want to have to bring us back. So if the city does decide to go through with the police lieutenant rather than patrol officer, is that something that would then go back to the finance committee, or would that be done through a budget amendment that's been in the process already laid out?
Yep. My thought at this point would be there would be a budget amendment to potentially make that change. Okay, so the recommended budget includes contingency funds. We have a general contingency of $25,000. That's money that's not allocated for a particular project, but it's there in the event of unforeseen costs, emergency situations, a really bad winter, a police incident causing overtime, or any number of various items. There's a personnel contingency included to cover a recommended cost of living adjustment of 2% for non-union staff. That's $40,000. And then there's also $35,000 available in the personnel contingency, which would provide a pool of funds for the potential settlement of a police union contract. And we're just starting negotiations at this point, so we don't know what the final costs are going to be there. It also would allow us some funds to look at a potential wage adjustment for the police lieutenant position based on market conditions and a potential wage compression issue as we look at the net costs or net compensation for the sergeants and the lieutenant position. And then finally, we also are looking at a potential fire union contract for the new city fire department that's being established. And between either the general contingency or the personnel contingencies, there may be some dollars there to help address any additional costs for that contract. And then the library budget includes funds as well. There's about $24,000 in total included in the library budget for both a 2% cost of living adjustment for library staff as well as wage adjustments for 3 library positions. This slide just provides some information on the recommended cost of living adjustments for various communities within Dane County. As I mentioned, Verona is recommended at 2%. The range for communities in this area is looking at between 1% in Fitchburg to a 2.5% in Monona, with several communities in about the 2% range. And then some other items that did not get included in the recommended budget. We had requested funds for an HR or compensation consultant, $15,000. That was not included, just did not meet the priorities. It's something I think we should look at in the future budgets as dollars allow. There's also not funding included for a citywide review of compensation or market adjustments. And my recommendation is that we take a comprehensive look at both compensation and benefit levels and costs, in particular with changes in Wisconsin retirement system, looking at changes in the health insurance marketplace, and then factor compensation into that. And we do that analysis during the year in 2014, and then that would allow us for the 2015 budget to make more informed decisions about what amount of dollars or savings there may be in those areas and incorporate that into a 2015 budget recommendation. Fire department had requested additional part-time and paid-on-call or paid-on-premises staff to begin staffing one position in the evening hours. There was a cost of about $80,000 for that initiative, and that was not recommended in part due to just concern about the overall funding level within the budget, but also the recognition that we're likely going to be operating a construction project during the year in 2014, and if a portion of the current facility needs to be taken down during construction and we're building the new facility, it may be very challenging to find adequate quarters for somebody to be living on site and responding in the evening. I've talked with the fire chief. I know he has some concerns wanting to make sure that we have adequate response times in the evening, and I have asked him to look at other alternatives if we're not able to fund the full staffing request, if there's other options, looking at an on-call program or other things that can be done with other communities to try to find a way to address this. So it's something where we may be coming back with some additional information, but yeah, the full request is recommended to be delayed at least 1 year until the facility is complete. The library has requested several additional positions, a total of 8 additional positions that would be added with the understanding that that may not be able to be done all in 1 year, but to go the direction that they're looking for about being able to meet circulation demands, programming demands, adding more programming, and potentially adding Sunday library hours. Those positions were not recommended to be included in the budget, and that primarily came down to the available funds that we had and trying to look at priorities. But that's something that we could consider in future years as dollars allow. And then the senior center also requested several items, some additional support hours for administrative staff, additional transportation for special events, and an acceleration of their replacement funding to allow for flooring replacement to take place in 2014 rather than 2015. Again, those requests all have merit, but it just came down to trying to prioritize items with the budget, which is why they were not included. The next couple slides go through items within the capital budget. First, listing some of our major projects that would be funded by borrowing. Again, the largest projects would be partial funding for the fire and EMS station, County Highway M and PD intersection, including right-of-way acquisition, and then a placeholder for improvements for Verona Avenue, both at Main and Verona Avenue if there's any right-of-way that needs to be acquired there, or potentially looking at Verona Avenue and Lincoln Street and some improvements to that intersection. All of these items that are funded by borrowing, while we identify a number in the budget for planning purposes, all of these do come back for the council, and the council has another opportunity to review the projects and act on whether or not they're included before we would do our borrowing package in the fall, or excuse me, in the summer. And then there's a list of about $392,000 of capital levy and replacement fund items that would be funded through cash for replacement or out of our replacement funds. And this does represent an increase over the 2013 capital levy and replacement funds as we try to work back towards funding more items with cash and not relying on borrowing. With that, I'd like to transition over, unless there are any questions. Okay, going on to budget scenarios.
Go ahead, Ms. Doyle.
I don't know if this would be an appropriate time for it, but I actually had a question about the evening staffing for the fire chief, if possible.
Sure.
Just was wondering, would we see an increase or better response time at night with only one additional staff member, or would we need to wait to have 2 members to actually man the truck to see more of a?
The plan was to have a lieutenant and or a driver in the station. Quite often our delay is waiting for a driver to get to the station before the truck can go. Firefighters get there quickly, but they're not all capable of driving the apparatus. You have to be certified and trained to do that. So yeah, it would improve our response time at night, even having the one person there. Wouldn't be a drastic improvement, but we're looking at incrementally adding staffing over time to get to where we would have an engine company staffed.
Okay, so you would have the driver there who would still need to wait for an additional?
Correct.
Okay. Just wanted to make.
Go ahead, Bill.
Okay. The next couple slides relate to some of the other scenarios that we presented in addition to the recommended scenario at 3%. In discussions with the Finance Committee, we looked at scenarios going from a 0% tax rate all the way up to if we had maximized the levy limit with any available adjustments. Just in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all the numbers, but wanted to provide that as background information. We've also updated our staffing projections based on what is proposed in the 2014 budget, which including a utility GIS technician position would be an increase of 3.2 total FTE for the city, as well as reflecting that we'd be establishing the city fire department and including those numbers in our total. And then projected going forward, for fire you can see the equivalent of 2 positions a year. Those are not necessarily full-time firefighters, but would be paid on premises hours to be able to accomplish what the chief was discussing about being able to staff positions in the evening. And then also looking at what we think we'd be able to support with trying to keep a reasonable tax rate increase for other positions within the city in future years. As we look forward to potential amendments on the budget, just a couple numbers and items to keep in consideration. 1% change in the equalized city tax rate is the equivalent to about $82,000. We've always tried very hard to look at one-time versus ongoing revenues and expenditures and not try to fund ongoing costs such as a new position with one-time savings or a one-time cut that would be a single savings. Obviously, new positions have a long-term impact on the budget. Several of our funds, such as special revenue funds and utilities, while they're an important part of our budget, are not funded by the property tax levy, so that's important to keep in consideration. And then with borrowing and debt service, as I mentioned, there will be another opportunity to review any proposed items to be funded by borrowing. And the way debt service works, the year that we borrow the funds, we don't have a cost, and we would begin paying debt service costs in the following year and then each of the subsequent years. We've talked about fund balance and our projections in the past. This is just an update of that projection, and it shows that the city is planning, and the 2014 budget includes budgeted use of fund balance in the amount of $275,000. That is projected to continue for an additional year in 2015, and then with the potential closure of the TIF district, TIF number 7, we're anticipating that would give us an opportunity to remove that budgeting use of fund balance within our budget and be able to stay within our target range, which is currently 25 to 35%.
And Bill, if I could, just the importance of having that fund balance, and the council certainly has heard this before. It's for cash flow purposes, also for if we would experience any emergencies, natural or other type of emergencies, and also that the lower the fund balance that we have when we get rated with our financial rating, Moody's and Fitch's, the lower our rating, the more we would pay, a higher interest rate we would pay every time we borrow money. So it is appropriate to have a fund balance.
Yeah, correct. Okay, and then I have a few slides looking more specifically at the property tax impact. This first slide, again, is a number of reference information looking at our tax levy, which is the total amount of funds that would be collected from property taxes. We have both our equalized value and our assessed value, and I just want to point out that the difference between those is equalized value is subject to an adjustment that the State Department of Revenue does each year. They're trying to look at a consistent number from one year to the next, or if you're comparing one municipality to the next. The assessed value is what our assessor comes up with, and the assessment notices that are mailed out to everyone is based on assessed value. And since this was a revaluation year, the two should be very close, and we're projecting that there'll be less than 1% difference between the equalized and assessed value. And then the city equalized mill rate, again based on that equalized value, which is more of an apples-to-apples comparison from year to year. The recommended budget is at a 3%. When we calculate what the city portion of the tax rate would be, we're projecting that that rate would be at a 4.9% increase. However, because it was a revaluation year and that for residential properties, the average property had a decrease in value, we're projecting that the tax impact on the again, theoretical average city house would only be about a 1% increase. And I know that's a little confusing, so I did have a slide that I wanted to get to here that gives some specific examples. First, just to put it into context, this is a slide that shows for the last budget, the 2013 budget, where Verona's tax rate was compared to other municipalities within Dane County. And then this slide takes a look at some examples because of the revaluation year. So for the last budget, the 2013 budget, according to the assessor, the average single-family home was $282,700. And based on the city tax rate, that would have been a city portion of the tax bill of $1,825. And then I've looked at several different examples showing what if that property had a 10% decrease in value, what would happen to their city tax, all the way to if they had 10% increase in their value, what would happen. And you could see that individual properties would be impacted very differently depending on how much their property assessment changed compared to the average. Again, according to the assessor, the average single-family home in 2013 was $272,000. So for that average home, if they went from $282,700 to $272,000, that would be a 3.8% decrease in their home's value. Their city taxes would be estimated at $1,842, and that would be just under a 1% increase. However, if they increased or decreased by more or less than that, they may actually see that their taxes from the city would stay the same, could go down, or could go up, and it really depends on what happened with their individual assessment. And then finally, we've tried to compile all of this information together, looking at the debt service projections, the staffing projections, equalized value, and we've made some estimates of where we expect our future tax rate to be. So for 2012 and 13, we saw increases in the equalized rate of 1% and 1.4%. In 2014, based on the recommended budget, we're looking at a 3% increase. We are projecting a 4% increase in 2015, and part of the reason why we're projecting a higher number for that year is because we are expecting to see some increase in debt service costs. In 2016, the reason for the 10% projected decrease is that that's when we're expecting to see the impact of TIF 7 closing. And then after that, we would expect that we'd be somewhere around a 2% increase. And again, that would depend on future staffing changes and items that are approved, as well as future projects and other costs that would be approved. The farther we get out, the harder it is to project.
I think, Bill, on this slide, it's important to note, and you said it early on, is this is for the city portion of the taxes only.
Yeah, that's a good clarification, that all of these numbers we're talking about are only talking about the city portion of the tax levy and the tax amount on the tax bill. And the city is just a little bit under 30% of the total. I think we're about 28% of the total. So this is just looking at that portion. It's not looking at the school district, county, MATC, or any of the other pieces of the tax bill. Okay, and then just a couple final comments on the process and timeline from here. We have put together a budget amendment form that people can use if they would like this year, if there are any proposed amendments to the budget. That includes a place for information identifying what part of the budget would be affected, a description where you'd indicate what the intended effect is or what change people would like to see, what the dollar amount impact is, and if that's something that would impact the property tax levy, I think it would be important to identify there both what the actual dollar amount of the change is and what portion of that or what impact that would have on the tax levy. And that's something that staff can help with if there's any questions about that. And then we do have a place on there for administration comments to put things like what the impact of the amendment would be in future budgets, whether it's a one-time or an ongoing cost or savings, and then we would identify the specific account detail that would be affected so that if there are amendments proposed and that are being discussed when the budget is put together, that we can compile that information, and we intend to have a spreadsheet available that we can look at what the impacts would be based on which amendments are included. And then as far as the process and the timeline from here, tonight we're doing the presentation. There would be a suggested deadline of 10 a.m. on Friday the 15th for any potential budget amendments to be submitted to staff. And that would give us time to go through, do that analysis of the amendments, and compile a list of everything that's been proposed. Then next Monday, the 18th at 6 p.m., there's another committee of the whole meeting, and that would be a working session to go through the amendments, have the authors of the amendments discuss them, make their argument for it, and have debate or discussion about the impacts. Then there would be another suggested date of the 20th at 10 a.m. for anybody that wants to revise or withdraw their amendment after the discussion on the 18th. And then we would have the city council meeting at 7 p.m. on November 25th, and that's when there would be the official budget public hearing, as well as potential action on the budget and action on the tax levy. And that's a lot of information, but I'd be available for any questions.
Thank you, Bill, for that. You did a great job of not only putting it together, but explaining it. Questions from Committee of the Whole members or comments? Questions or comments? I am not seeing any at this point. If there's, well, there is no action other than adjournment. We cannot take any other action. So if there's no questions or comments, I would accept the motion to adjourn the Committee of the Whole. Sir, Mr. Manley?
Sorry, just one question. I want to be clear on the budget amendment process. That's 10 o'clock by this Friday is the deadline for submitting revisions to the budget that came out of the Finance Committee.
Yeah, that's correct. We were hoping to get the amendments to the budget coming out of the Finance Committee. That's what's on the table right now. And if there would be any amendments, we've asked for that deadline, so we have time to compile a list and get that out to everyone in advance of the meeting on the 18th.
And those amendments will be discussed at the meeting here on the 18th?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Doyle?
Just to go back to the tax rate projections, I think just to connect the dots here, so the point with the 2016 possible decrease in the city taxes was because it's only a small portion of the overall property taxes, there could be no decrease in overall taxes if, say, MATC or county were to go up. So with the TIF 7 closure, there may not be a decrease in people's property taxes, correct?
Yeah, that's a possibility. We're projecting that the city portion would go down by 10%, but that's the only piece that the city controls, and that represents less than a third of a people's total property tax bill. When you're looking at the county and MATC, the impact of our TIF closing compared to their overall total tax base is going to be a much smaller percentage, so we'd expect to have a much smaller impact on their portion of the tax bill. Also for the school district, there are complications based on how the state funding formula works. It's an equalization formula, so the more the local property tax base increases, the less they receive in state aid. So there may be an impact, especially in the short term for the schools, but it's not as direct of an impact for the city. And I think the point to make is just that we can only control the city's portion of the tax bill, and when people look at their total tax bill, it'll be subject to all those other jurisdictions as well.
In addition to what Mr. Burns just said, the school district is aware of that, and they have built that into their projections for their future budgets as well. Seeing no other comments, a motion to adjourn the Committee of the Whole would be in order. We have a motion by Mr. Manley. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Ms. Doyle. All those in favor of adjourning the public hearing, or excuse me, adjourning the Committee of the Whole, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion carried. We are adjourned.